I signed the papers because it was my sister asking, and sisters don't steal from you. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3:42 p.m., and we were sitting at her kitchen island, drinking coffee from chipped mugs. The document was only 6 pages long. I didn't read page 4 carefully enough. She kept tapping her phone while I signed. 2 weeks later, I found out my name was still there but my rights were gone. And that was the moment I realized everything I trusted had already been rearranged without me. I didn't grow up believing people were evil. I grew up believing people were careless at worst, busy at best, and mostly decent if you gave them enough context. That belief carried me through 36 years of life in the Midwest, through a stable career, through a quiet marriage that ended politely, and through a family dynamic where I was always the one expected to be flexible. I was the reliable sister, the one who showed up early, paid on time, and didn't make scenes. That reputation felt earned. It also made me dangerous to myself. I live in Overland Park, Kansas. Not the part people imagine when they hear Kansas, but a clean suburb with manicured lawns, grocery stores that stay open late, and office parks full of people who believe in procedures. I worked as an operations manager for a regional logistics company, the kind of job that revolves around spreadsheets, compliance checklists, and deadlines that don't care how you feel. I liked it. I liked that the rules were written down. I liked that if something went wrong, you could trace it back to a line item instead of a personality flaw. My sister, Lauren, lived 15 minutes away in a newer development with larger houses and tighter homeowners association rules. She was younger by 3 years, louder by nature, and better at occupying space. Where I was methodical, Lauren was persuasive. Where I waited, she acted. She worked in real estate, specialized in short-term rentals, and spoke fluently about leverage and holding structures in a way that made ordinary transactions sound strategic instead of risky. After my divorce, I rented for a while. Then, 2 years ago, I decided to buy a townhouse. Nothing flashy. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, attached garage, close to my office. It wasn't a dream home. It was a stability decision. I put down a solid down payment, locked in a reasonable interest rate, and felt proud of myself in a quiet way I didn't announce on social media. Lauren congratulated me enthusiastically. She brought a bottle of Prosecco over the night I got the keys and insisted we drink it sitting on the kitchen floor because I didn't have furniture yet. We laughed about how the echo made our voices sound too loud. At some point, she walked around taking pictures on her phone, commenting on the natural light, the stair angle, the potential. 6 months later, she called me with a favor. She said it casually, like she was asking to borrow a ladder. She had an opportunity, she said. A short-term rental near downtown Kansas City. High demand. Great numbers. The only issue was timing. Her credit was temporarily tied up because of another property closing, and the seller wanted paperwork signed quickly. I don't need money, she told me over the phone. Just your name, temporarily. I remember standing in my kitchen, one hand on the counter, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I asked the obvious questions. What exactly would I be signing? How long? What was the exit plan? Lauren answered without hesitation. She always did. It would be an LLC operating agreement, she said. Standard stuff. My name would be listed as a managing member for administrative reasons only. She would handle everything. I wouldn't be financially exposed. It was cleaner this way, faster, and completely legal. She had done it before, she said. Everyone did this. I hesitated just long enough to feel responsible, not long enough to feel alarmed. She came over the following Tuesday. That part stands out to me because I had taken a late lunch and rushed home, reheated leftovers, and worried about getting back to my afternoon meeting on time. She arrived with a slim folder tucked under her arm, kicked off her shoes by the door, and set her phone face down on the counter like she always did. We sat at my kitchen island. The paperwork was neat, clipped, already flagged where signatures were needed. 6 pages. I flipped through them quickly, more out of politeness than concern. The language was dense, the font small. I recognized some terms: managing member, capital contribution, authority to bind. I trusted that if something mattered, Lauren would point it out. She didn't rush me. That's the part that fooled me later. She just talked. About the property. About how annoying the seller was being. about how this would all be over in a month. At one point, she tapped her phone lightly against the counter. Once, twice, like she was keeping time to a song I couldn't hear. I noticed it. I didn't question it. I signed where the yellow tabs were. She thanked me, hugged me, and left with the folder tucked back under her arm. I washed the coffee mugs and went back to work. By the end of the day, the whole thing had already started to blur into the category of favors that feel bigger when you agree to them than when they're done. Nothing happened right away. That should have reassured me. It did. Over the next 2 weeks, life stayed normal. I went to work. I paid my mortgage. I texted Lauren occasionally about unrelated things, our mom's birthday plans, a show we both hated but kept watching. She didn't mention the property again, which I took as a good sign. If there was nothing to manage, there was nothing to discuss. The first odd thing was an email. It came from a bank I didn't use. The subject line was generic, account update notification. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something about the sender address looked legitimate. I opened it. It referenced an account number I didn't recognize and an entity name that sounded vaguely familiar. I skimmed it once, then again. It wasn't asking me to do anything. It was just informing me. I forwarded it to Lauren with a short note. For your information, not sure if this is related to the rental thing? She replied an hour later. Yes, that's tied to the LLC. Totally normal. You can ignore. Ignore was my specialty. I did. A few days later, another email. Then a voicemail. Then a letter that arrived in a plain white envelope with my name printed cleanly in the corner. I opened it, standing by the mailbox, the afternoon sun too bright, the paper too crisp. It referenced compliance. Required disclosures. Managing member responsibilities. That was the first time the word responsibility landed differently. I went back inside, set the letter on the counter, and stared at it longer than necessary. I told myself I was overreacting. This was business. This was paperwork catching up. Lauren knew what she was doing. Still, I pulled the folder from the drawer where I'd tucked my copy of the signed documents. I flipped to page 4. I don't remember exactly what I expected to see. A clause I'd missed, a footnote, something technical. Instead, I saw my name paired with words that didn't feel administrative at all. Exclusive authority, sole discretion, binding decisions. I sat down slowly. The house was quiet in a way that felt louder than noise. I called Lauren. She didn't answer. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A reasonable one. There always was. That belief had served me well for most of my life. I just didn't know yet that it was about to cost me far more than a signature. I didn't confront Lauren right away. That wasn't avoidance. Not exactly. It was habit. When something feels off, my instinct has always been to gather information first, to understand the shape of the problem before naming it out loud. I told myself I needed context. I told myself this was business, not betrayal, and business problems had solutions if you stayed calm long enough. The next morning, I went to work like nothing had changed. I answered emails, sat through a weekly operations meeting, nodded at the right moments. But my attention kept drifting back to the language on page 4. Exclusive authority. Sole discretion. Words that didn't belong to someone who was just helping out. During my lunch break, instead of eating, I pulled up the document on my phone and read it slowly this time, line by line, the way I read contracts at work when something didn't quite add up. What stood out wasn't one dramatic sentence. It was the pattern. Every clause that mentioned responsibility carried my name. Every clause that mentioned benefit, profit, or withdrawal authority carried Lauren's. It was clean, elegant, even. The kind of document that looked neutral until you understood what neutrality could hide. That afternoon, I called the number listed on the bank letter. A recorded menu answered, polite and endless. When I finally reached a human voice, I explained that I'd received correspondence about an account I didn't recognize. The woman on the line asked me to verify my identity, my full name, date of birth, last 4 digits of my social security number. She thanked me and placed me on a brief hold. When she came back, her tone was unchanged, but the information wasn't. Yes, ma'am, she said. You are listed as the primary authorized signer for the account associated with the LLC. Primary. Authorized. Signer. I stared at the window above my desk as she spoke, watching a delivery truck back into the loading bay across the street. I asked what that meant, practically. She explained it patiently. Any compliance issues, any discrepancies, any failures to report, they would contact me first. Is there a reason I wouldn't have access to the account? I asked. There was a pause, brief but deliberate. Access is determined by internal authorization settings. According to our records, you do not have online credentials for this account. I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still. That evening, Lauren finally called me back. She sounded cheerful, slightly breathless, like she was walking between appointments. I told her I had questions. She laughed lightly and said, "Of course I did. Paperwork always looked scarier than it was." I asked her directly why my name carried sole authority in the operating agreement. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she explained why it had been done that way. Lenders preferred a single point of accountability, she said. It made things cleaner, less confusion. Cleaner for who? I asked. For everyone, she replied, a little too quickly. I pressed. Why didn't I have access to the account? Why was I receiving compliance notices? She sighed, the sound sharp through the phone. You're overthinking this. This is just how these structures work. You're not actually on the hook for anything. It's fine to grass to ground. That phrase on the hook caught in my chest. I asked her to send me full access credentials. She said she would. Not immediately, she added, because she was in the middle of something. But soon. We hung up with nothing resolved. Over the next few days, the emails kept coming. Notices about filings, reminders about deadlines, each one addressed to me by name, each one framed as a courtesy, not a warning. I started a folder on my desktop and dropped them in, telling myself this was temporary, that Lauren would fix it once her closing finalized. I didn't tell anyone. Not my coworkers, not my friends, not even my mother. I didn't want to make it real by saying it out loud. As long as it stayed contained inside me, it felt manageable. The first real shift happened the following week. I was sitting in my car outside the grocery store when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar but local. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. The man on the line introduced himself as a city compliance officer. He was polite, efficient, and clearly accustomed to these conversations. He asked if I was aware of a short-term rental property operating under my authority that had failed a recent safety inspection. I told him I didn't operate a short-term rental. There was a pause. Our records show otherwise. He explained that the property had been cited for multiple violations, fire safety issues, missing documentation. Nothing catastrophic yet, but unresolved. Notices had been sent, deadlines passed. To be clear, I said slowly, you're calling me because my name is on the file. Yes, ma'am. I asked what would happen next. He explained the process. Fines, potential suspension of permits, escalation if non-compliance continued. I hung up and sat there, groceries forgotten, my hands still on the steering wheel. For the first time, the situation felt physical, not abstract, not contractual, real consequences attached to my name. That night, I drove to Lauren's house unannounced. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't slam the door or raise my voice. I just stood on her porch while she fumbled with the lock, clearly surprised to see me. Inside, her house looked like it always did, staged but lived in, neutral colors. A faint smell of citrus cleaner. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter while I spoke. I told her about the call, about the emails, about page 4. She listened without interrupting, her expression neutral in a way that felt practiced. When I finished, she nodded once and said, "Okay, let me explain." What followed wasn't an apology. It was a justification. She explained that things had gotten complicated, that the property wasn't performing as expected, that there had been delays, issues, unexpected expenses. She said she hadn't wanted to stress me out until she had a handle on it. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner. She said, "Because you would have panicked." That stung more than I expected. I asked her to remove my name. She said it wasn't that simple. There were processes, timelines, paperwork. She said she was working on it. I asked for a timeline. She didn't give me one. Instead, she said something that shifted everything. She said, "You agreed to this. You signed." The room felt smaller after that. I went home and slept poorly. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not because I wanted to escalate, but because I needed someone to translate what I was seeing into plain language. I chose a small firm in town, the kind that handled boring, practical matters. The consultation was brief, efficient. The attorney read the operating agreement quietly, flipping pages without comment. When she finished, she looked up at me. "You are the responsible party," she said. "Legally." I asked what that meant in the worst-case scenario. She answered without drama. "Fines, liability, potential civil exposure if something went wrong at the property." I asked if Lauren had done anything illegal. She shook her head. "No, she did something strategic." That word landed heavier than any accusation. I drove home afterward with the radio off, my thoughts loud and unhelpful. I kept replaying the moment at the kitchen island. The chipped mugs, the tapping phone, the yellow tabs. There had been no threats, no pressure, just familiarity. That night, I pulled every document, every email, every voicemail into one place. I printed some of them, spread them across my dining table, and started organizing them by date. Not because I had a plan yet, but because order felt like the only thing I could still control. Somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m., I noticed something I hadn't before. A timestamp, an automated system note buried in an email footer. It referenced a change in account permissions. The date was 3 days before Lauren had come over with the folder. I stared at it for a long time. That was when the story shifted from confusion to clarity. Not all at once, not cleanly, but enough that I understood one thing with certainty. This hadn't spiraled. It had been set up, and whatever I did next couldn't be based on trust anymore. Once I saw the timestamp, I couldn't unsee it. It sat there in the footer of the email like a quiet confession, a line of system language that didn't know it was telling the truth. 3 days before Lauren sat at my kitchen island, 3 days before the yellow tabs, 3 days before I signed anything. The permissions had already been adjusted. The structure had already been decided. What I'd signed wasn't a starting point, it was a confirmation. That realization didn't make me angry right away. It made me careful. I've always been someone who believes in good faith, not in a naive, everything will work out way, but in a practical one. If you follow the rules, if you communicate clearly, if you don't cut corners, things usually land where they should. That belief had shaped how I lived, how I worked, how I handled conflict. It had also shaped how I saw my sister. Lauren and I grew up in the same house, but we learned different lessons. I learned that being steady made you trustworthy. Lauren learned that being decisive made you powerful. Neither of us were wrong, but power and trust don't play by the same rules. When we were kids, she was the one who talked our way out of trouble. I was the one who made sure there was no trouble to begin with. Teachers praised her confidence and praised my reliability. Our parents joked that together we made one functional adult. It was said lightly, affectionately. I never questioned the implication that I was the supporting half. That dynamic followed us into adulthood in ways I didn't examine closely enough. When Lauren talked about her deals, her strategies, her structures, I listened the way you listen to someone speaking a different professional language. I didn't challenge her. Not because I thought she was smarter, but because I thought our roles were clear. She moved fast. I kept things grounded. Looking back, that division of labor was convenient for both of us. Until it wasn't. After finding the timestamp, I didn't call her. I didn't confront her. I didn't even tell my lawyer what I'd found. I needed to understand the full shape of what had been done before I decided how to respond. That was my instinct kicking in again, for better or worse. At work, I started paying closer attention to how systems documented change. It wasn't unusual for me. Process audits were part of my job. But this time, the lens was personal. I noticed how every action left a trail, how every adjustment created a record somewhere, even if it was buried or automated or written in language meant to be skimmed past. That night, I logged into the state's business entity portal. I'd never had a reason to before. I searched the LLC by name. It came up immediately. Active, in good standing. My name listed prominently, right where it shouldn't have been. I clicked through the filings. Amendments, annual reports, a formation document dated a week before Lauren had asked for my help. My name was already there. The room felt colder. I checked the thermostat. It hadn't changed. I printed everything. Not because I was planning something specific yet, but because holding paper felt different than staring at a screen. Paper made it real. Paper also made it harder to ignore. I started a timeline on a legal pad. Dates on the left, events on the right, calls, emails, filings. Each line tightened the picture. This hadn't been a favor that went sideways. It had been a structure built in advance, with me slotted neatly into the role that carried weight without control. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't had since the first bank call. It wasn't relief. It was resolve. If my name was being used as leverage, then I needed to understand exactly how that leverage worked. I took a personal day and drove to the city offices downtown. Not to make a scene, just to ask questions. The building was nondescript, the kind of place you'd never notice if you weren't looking for it. Fluorescent lights. Plastic chairs. A counter worn smooth by paperwork sliding back and forth. I waited my turn and explained, calmly, that I was listed as a managing member of a short-term rental property and needed clarification on compliance requirements. The clerk didn't blink. She pulled up the file, scanned the screen, and began explaining the process like she'd done it 1,000 times. Inspections, permits, fines, escalation paths. I asked who had submitted the last compliance response. She told me a name, not Lauren's. An email address I didn't recognize. Is that person authorized? I asked. She glanced back at the screen. According to our records, no, but they're responding on behalf of the entity. Is that allowed? She shrugged slightly. It happens. Ultimately, responsibility falls on the managing member. That was me. Again. I thanked her and left, my questions answered and multiplied at the same time. On the drive home, I thought about the version of myself from a month ago, the one who believed that clarity prevented conflict, the one who thought trust was neutral. I realized how much of my life had been built around the idea that being reasonable would protect me. It hadn't. That afternoon, Lauren texted me. Just a check-in. Everything okay? She wrote, as if nothing had shifted. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. We need to talk, I typed, then deleted it. I didn't want a conversation. I wanted alignment, and I knew better now than to expect it voluntarily. Instead, I replied, I'm reviewing the filings. I'll follow up. She didn't respond right away. That evening, I called my lawyer again and told her about the timestamp, the filings, the compliance issue. She listened, asked precise questions, and then said something that reframed everything. She positioned you as the buffer, she said. If things go wrong, you absorb the impact. If things go right, she retains flexibility. I asked if that was common. It's not uncommon, she said carefully. It's also not accidental. We talked through options. None of them were dramatic. None involved confrontation or accusations. They involved notices, requests, documentation, formal steps that felt boring on the surface but carried weight underneath. When I hung up, I didn't feel empowered. I felt exposed. Power, I was learning, wasn't loud. It was procedural. Over the next few days, I noticed how often Lauren framed things as temporary. Just for now. Until this clears. Short term. I had accepted that language my whole life. It made discomfort feel manageable. It also made boundaries negotiable. I stopped accepting it. I sent a written request for full account access, not a text, not a call, an email, copied to an address listed in the filings. I asked for confirmation in writing. Hours passed. Then a day. Lauren called that night, her voice sharper than it had been before. She asked why I was escalating. I told her I wasn't. I was clarifying. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, she said. I didn't make it this size, I replied. She accused me of not trusting her. I didn't argue. Trust, I realized, was no longer the point. Responsibility was. After we hung up, I sat at my dining table and looked at the spread of papers again. The timeline was complete now. The shape of it undeniable. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be smoothed over. It was a system that relied on my silence to function. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because things were resolved. They weren't. But because I finally understood what I was dealing with. Not a sister who made a mistake. Not a deal that went wrong. But a structure designed to move risk away from the person who knew how to avoid it. The belief that had carried me this far, that fairness would emerge if I stayed reasonable, was no longer serving me. It hadn't protected me. It had positioned me. By morning, I knew something else too. Whatever came next couldn't be emotional. It couldn't be reactive. And it couldn't be private. If my name was going to carry weight, then I was going to decide how it was used. Once I decided not to confront Lauren emotionally, everything slowed down in a way that felt unnatural at first. I had spent weeks bracing for some kind of explosion, raised voices, accusations, a moment where the truth finally snapped into the open. Instead, what came next was quiet, administrative, almost polite, and that was somehow worse. The first red flag I noticed after that decision wasn't dramatic. It was a calendar invite. It appeared in my inbox on a Thursday morning, sandwiched between internal work meetings and a dentist appointment reminder. The subject line read, LLC Operations Sync. No sender name I recognized. No explanation, just a time and a dial-in number. I opened the invite details. My name was listed as the meeting owner. I hadn't created it. I declined the invite and forwarded it to Lauren with a single line. Who scheduled this? She responded an hour later. Oh, that's probably the property manager. They looped you in automatically since you're the managing member. No action needed. No action needed had become her favorite phrase. I started noticing how often my role was described as passive, even as it carried responsibility. Managing member, but not managing anything. Authorized signer, but unable to sign. Accountable, but uninformed. It was a strange inversion. And once I saw it everywhere. The next small thing was mail. Not official notices this time, just envelopes addressed to the LLC, arriving at my townhouse instead of Lauren's office. I stacked them neatly on the counter, unopened at first, telling myself I'd sort through them later. When I finally did, they turned out to be routine statements, vendor correspondence, one invoice for a safety inspection that hadn't been paid. The amounts weren't alarming. That wasn't the point. The point was that the paper trail was slowly being rerouted through me, inch by inch, like a river changing course. At work, I found myself distracted in meetings, listening for patterns instead of content. Who spoke first? Who summarized decisions? Who carried blame when timelines slipped? I realized how familiar this structure felt. I'd seen it professionally a dozen times before. I just hadn't recognized it when it was happening to me. Lauren called less frequently after that. When she did, the tone had shifted, still friendly, but guarded. She asked questions that felt like tests. Did anyone contact you? Have you heard from the city again? I answered honestly but briefly. I didn't volunteer information. I also stopped reassuring her. That seemed to bother her more than anything else. One evening, she stopped by unannounced. I hadn't invited her, but I didn't turn her away. She stood in my kitchen, the same space where everything had begun, and looked around like she was assessing it for the first time. You seem stressed, she said. I'm focused, I replied. She frowned slightly, as if those words didn't fit together. She asked if I was upset with her. I told her I was concerned about the structure we'd set up. She said structure was exactly what made it safe. She reminded me that nothing bad had actually happened yet. I pointed to the stack of mail on the counter, asked why it was coming to me. She shrugged and said forwarding addresses were tricky. I asked why someone else was responding to compliance notices under my name. She said it was just an assistant, helping move things along. Every answer was plausible. None of them resolved the underlying issue. She left after 20 minutes, promising again that everything would be sorted soon. I watched her walk to her car, the way she always did, confident, unhurried, like someone who believed time was on her side. The next red flag arrived 2 days later, buried in an online portal I checked almost out of habit. There was a new filing listed, a minor amendment, I clicked it open and scanned the page. It adjusted internal voting thresholds. My name was still there. My authority, however, had been diluted. Not eliminated. Just softened. Shared. In theory. Functionally irrelevant. I didn't remember signing anything like that. I checked the signature line. It wasn't mine. It didn't need to be. The amendment fell under operational changes that could be enacted by majority interest. Lauren held the majority interest. I sat back in my chair and let that settle. This was the version of harm that didn't announce itself. No confrontation, no theft in the traditional sense. Just quiet rearrangement. That night, I wrote everything down again. Not the timeline this time, but the feelings I'd been suppressing. The constant low-level vigilance. The way my stomach tightened every time my phone buzzed. The exhaustion of being technically responsible for something I couldn't influence. I realized how much energy I'd spent trying to remain reasonable. The following week, the city called again. This time, it wasn't a courtesy reminder, it was a formal notice. Still calm, still professional, but firmer. Deadlines had been missed. Fines would be assessed. I asked who had been contacted previously. The officer listed email addresses. None of them were mine. I asked why I wasn't copied. "You're listed as the responsible party," he said, "but not as the primary contact." I closed my eyes for a moment after hanging up. This was the part no one warns you about. The gap between responsibility and control. The way it wears you down slowly, not through crisis, but through accumulation. Lauren texted me later that day. "Heard the city is being annoying again. Don't worry, I'm handling it." I didn't respond. That silence was new. And it wasn't accidental. A few nights later, I sat on my couch scrolling through old photos on my phone. Family holidays, birthdays, moments where Lauren had her arm around my shoulder, smiling broadly, introducing me as my sister, the organized one. I'd always worn that label with pride. Now it felt like a warning. The smallest red flag of all came in the form of a compliment. Lauren called and said, "I really appreciate how calm you've been about all this. Most people would have freaked out." I understood then that my calm wasn't reassuring to her. It was useful. If I panicked, I might disrupt the structure. If I stayed composed, the system could continue operating as designed. That was the moment something shifted inside me, not into anger, but into clarity. I stopped thinking about what Lauren intended. I stopped trying to decode her motives. Intentions were slippery. Structures were not. I requested copies of every communication sent under my name. I asked for access again, formally, in writing. I documented the lack of response. I scheduled a follow-up consultation with my lawyer and brought the amended filing with me. She read it once and nodded. "This is the pattern," she said. "Incremental changes, each one defensible on its own. Together, they tell a story." I asked her what the story was. "That you're being positioned to absorb risk without power," she replied. "And that the longer this goes on, the harder it is to unwind." I drove home slowly after that meeting, taking side streets instead of the highway, letting myself feel the weight of what I'd been avoiding. Not betrayal, in the dramatic sense, but exploitation built on familiarity. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind kept returning to one simple truth. None of these red flags had required my consent. They only required my silence. And I was done providing it. The letter arrived on a Monday. It wasn't dramatic. No bold lettering. No threatening language. Just a standard envelope with the city seal in the corner and my name typed cleanly across the front. I almost set it aside with the rest of the mail, but something about the weight of it made me open it immediately, standing there by the door with my keys still in my hand. It was a notice of administrative hearing. I read it once, then again, slower. The hearing concerned repeated compliance failures associated with a short-term rental property operating under an LLC where I was listed as the managing member. The date was 3 weeks away. The location was downtown. Attendance was mandatory. Mandatory. I leaned against the wall and let the words settle. This wasn't a reminder. This wasn't informational. This was procedural escalation, the kind that moved quietly until it didn't. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the letter a third time. It outlined the issues succinctly: missed deadlines, unresolved violations, Lack of response from the responsible party. That responsible party was me. I checked my email immediately, searching for anything I might have missed. There was nothing. No notices, no warnings, no requests for action addressed directly to me. Everything that had led to this point had happened adjacent to me, not through me. I called the number listed on the notice. After navigating the usual menus, I reached a clerk who confirmed what the letter already said. The hearing would proceed whether I attended or not. If I failed to appear, the penalties would increase. I asked who else would be notified. Only the managing member, she replied. I thanked her and hung up. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the grain of the table, tracing the lines with my eyes like they might offer some explanation. This was the event that shifted everything from theoretical to unavoidable. I was no longer just adjacent to the problem, I was its formal face. I called Lauren. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail. Short, controlled. I told her about the notice and the hearing date. I asked her to call me back immediately. She texted instead. I'm in back-to-back meetings. Can we talk later? This sounds more serious than it is. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. That afternoon, I left work early and drove downtown to the municipal building. I didn't have an appointment. I didn't expect answers. I just needed to see the place where this was now officially happening. The building was old, concrete and glass, with a lobby that smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. People sat in rows of plastic chairs, clutching folders, murmuring quietly. I took a number and waited. When it was my turn, I explained the situation to the clerk at the counter. She listened without reaction, pulled up the file, and turned the screen slightly so I could see. It was worse than I'd thought. There were notes logged over the past 2 months. Attempts to contact the entity. Responses submitted late or not at all. A pattern of partial compliance that never fully resolved the issues. Who's been responding? I asked. She scrolled. Looks like a property management firm. Authorized by whom? She paused. That's not clear. And faced on 7. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not panic. Recognition. I asked what the hearing entailed. She explained the process. I would be asked to account for the violations and present a plan to bring the property into compliance. If the plan was accepted, fines would be assessed and deadlines set. If not, the permit could be suspended. And if it's suspended? I asked. She met my eyes. You'd still be responsible for the outstanding issues. And one of the sitter, don't come. I nodded, thanked her, and stepped away from the counter. Outside, the afternoon was bright, the city moving at its usual pace, unaware of the quiet shift that had just occurred inside me. I sat in my car and called my lawyer. She didn't sugarcoat it. This is the point where you need to decide whether you're going to keep absorbing this or interrupt it. I asked what interrupting looked like. Formally, she said, documented, visible. That night, Lauren finally called. She sounded irritated, not worried. She asked why I'd gone downtown without telling her. I told her because I was the one being summoned. She said she'd handle it. That she'd talk to the property manager. That these things happened all the time. She said hearings were routine. Then why am I the only one required to attend? I asked. She hesitated. Just for a second. You're overreacting, she said. This is just process. That word again, process. The thing I'd always trusted. The thing now being used to corner me. I told her I needed full access to the account and all correspondence immediately. I told her I needed to understand what had been submitted under my name. She bristled. She said I was making it adversarial. She said I was acting like she'd done something wrong. I'm acting like my name is on the line, I replied. The call ended without resolution. The next day, I requested records from the city, public documents, filings, correspondence. It was all available, it turned out, if you knew where to look. It took time, forms, waiting, but nothing stopped me from accessing it. What I received was a digital folder full of quiet decisions. Emails sent from accounts I didn't recognize, signed with my name. Responses submitted late, sometimes incomplete. Promises of corrective action that never materialized. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. This wasn't just negligence. It was delegation without consent. My identity used as insulation. I printed everything. That evening, I sat at my table again, the papers spread out like evidence. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was focused. This was the moment I'd been moving toward without knowing it. The moment where the situation demanded more than patience. I drafted an email to Lauren. Not emotional, not accusatory, just factual. I referenced the hearing, the filings, the lack of access. I requested immediate transfer of authority or removal of my name. I copied my lawyer. I didn't send it right away. I read it twice, then once more. When I finally pressed send, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief, alignment. The hearing notice sat folded on the table, a quiet reminder of what was at stake. I understood now that this wasn't about fixing a mistake. It was about deciding whether I would continue to be the easiest solution to someone else's problem. 3 weeks suddenly felt very close. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't waiting for Lauren to act. I was preparing to be seen. The days after I sent the email moved differently. Not faster, not slower, just heavier. Lauren didn't respond right away. That, in itself, wasn't unusual. She was good at creating space when it benefited her. What felt different was the silence on every other channel. No casual texts, no memes, no check-ins. It was as if the relationship had been put on hold, suspended like a call that never disconnects but never resumes either. I kept going to work. I kept making dinner. I kept answering emails that had nothing to do with me personally. On the surface, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. The first time I felt it physically was in the shower. I stood there longer than usual, the water running hot, staring at the tile. My thoughts weren't racing. They were flat, organized, almost clinical. I wasn't scared. I wasn't angry. I felt emptied out in a way that left room for something else, something colder and steadier. That was new. 2 days after the email, a reply finally came. Not from Lauren, from her assistant. It was brief, polite. It acknowledged receipt of my message and said Lauren was reviewing the situation and would follow up soon. No mention of the hearing, no mention of access, no apology. I forwarded it to my lawyer without comment. That afternoon, I received another email from the city. This one confirmed my attendance at the hearing and included a list of documents I was expected to bring. Proof of ownership, proof of compliance, proof of corrective action. Each item on the list landed like a small weight added to my chest. Not crushing, accumulative. I printed the list and laid it beside the other papers on my table. The stack had grown thick enough to feel ridiculous. If someone had walked in, it would have looked like I was preparing for a trial. In a way, I was. That night, Lauren called. Her voice sounded controlled, almost formal. She said she'd been meaning to talk to me. She said things had gotten more complicated than she'd anticipated. She said she felt blindsided by how I'd handled things. I needed to protect myself, I said. That email made it seem like you don't trust me, she replied. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I realized the conversation had shifted into a familiar pattern. Her feelings, her framing, her discomfort. This isn't about trust anymore, I said finally. It's about responsibility. She accused me of escalating, of making something internal external, of involving lawyers unnecessarily. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I said something that surprised both of us. I'm not asking for reassurance. I'm asking for authority to match my liability. There was a pause on the line. A long one. She said she needed time to think. I hung up and sat in the dark living room, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I felt strangely calm, like I'd stepped out of a storm and into a different kind of weather. The next morning, I took another personal day and drove back downtown. Not to the clerk this time, but to the records office. I requested certified copies of everything related to the LLC. Every filing, every amendment, every note. The woman behind the counter didn't ask why. She just handed me a form and told me the fee. I paid it without hesitation. While I waited, I watched people come and go. Some looked nervous, some annoyed, Some resigned. No one looked surprised. That struck me. This place existed because things like this happened all the time. I picked up the records later that afternoon and spread them across my table at home. I didn't read them immediately. I made tea. I sat down. I took a breath. Then I started. The pattern was undeniable now. Decisions made quickly. Adjustments logged quietly. Authority shifted incrementally, each step defensible. Together, devastating. There it was again. That feeling of something going quiet inside me. Not numbness. Focus. That evening, Lauren sent another message. This one longer. She acknowledged that the structure hadn't worked the way she'd intended. She said she was willing to discuss changes after the hearing. She said right now wasn't the best time to rock the boat. End quote. I stared at the phrase. The boat was already moving. I was just the one being asked to steady it. I replied once. The hearing is not a future problem. It's a present one. She didn't respond. The day before the hearing, I received a call from the property management firm. A man introduced himself and said he'd been trying to reach me for weeks. He sounded relieved, as if he'd finally found the right door. He explained that they'd been instructed to communicate through Lauren, that they'd submitted documents as requested, that they were under the impression I was informed. I asked him to email me everything. He agreed immediately. When the email arrived, it confirmed what I already knew. Promises made on my behalf, deadlines acknowledged and missed, plans proposed and abandoned. I thanked him and asked one final question. Who authorized you to speak for the entity? There was a pause. Lauren. That night, I laid out everything I would bring to the hearing. Originals, copies, notes. I wasn't sure what mattered yet, but I wasn't going in unprepared. I slept poorly, not from anxiety, but from alertness. My mind stayed just below the surface, running through contingencies. Not worst-case scenarios, just realities. The morning of the hearing, I dressed simply, neutral colors, nothing that drew attention. I arrived early and sat in the waiting area, my folder on my lap. Around me, other people waited. Some whispered to companions. Some stared at their phones. I sat quietly and observed. When my name was called, I stood and walked into the room. It wasn't dramatic. A long table, a few officials, a recorder, no jury, no raised voices, just process, finally directed at the right person. They asked me to explain the violations. I did, calmly, factually. I explained what I knew and what I didn't. I explained when I'd learned certain things. I explained what authority I had and what I lacked. They asked why the issues hadn't been resolved sooner. I told the truth. I didn't have access. There was a murmur at the table. Not outrage, interest. They asked for documentation. I provided it. Not all of it. Just enough. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, the chair thanked me for my cooperation and said they would be in touch with next steps. I walked out of the building and stood on the steps for a moment, blinking in the sunlight. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel defeated. I felt seen. That afternoon, Lauren called again. Her tone was different now. Careful. I told her. Briefly. She asked what I'd said. I told them the truth, I replied. There was silence on the line. Then she said something that confirmed everything I'd been feeling. You didn't have to do that. I closed my eyes. Yes, I said. I did. We hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I sat alone in my house. The papers stacked neatly, the folder closed for the first time in weeks. The hearing hadn't resolved anything yet. There would be fines, conditions, consequences. But something irreversible had happened. I was no longer invisible in a system designed to use me quietly. The part of me that had believed staying reasonable would keep me safe had finally gone silent. In its place was something steadier. And whatever came next, I would meet it awake. The email from the city arrived 3 days after the hearing. I was at my desk at work, halfway through reconciling a shipment discrepancy, when the notification slid onto my screen. The subject line was neutral, almost polite. Post-hearing. Follow-up. I didn't open it right away. I finished what I was doing first, saved the file, and closed out my system like I always did. Old habits die hard. Then I opened the email. It wasn't a verdict. It wasn't even a decision. It was a summary. The city thanked me for my cooperation, outlined the violations discussed, and attached a detailed record of communications related to the property: dates, times, senders, recipients, and audit trail. That was the phrase that caught my attention. Audit trail. I forwarded the email to my personal account and printed the attachment as soon as I got home. Page after page of logs, all automatically generated. No emotion, no interpretation, just data. And in that data, everything I needed was already there. Emails sent on my behalf from addresses that weren't mine. Documents uploaded under my name from IP addresses I'd never used. Responses submitted during hours I was at work, in meetings, nowhere near a keyboard. None of it was hidden. It didn't need to be. The system had simply assumed I was who the filings said I was. I sat at my table and started highlighting. Not everything, just patterns, repeated senders, consistent delays, the same assistant's email address popping up again and again, always just past the deadline, always apologetic, always promising resolution. What struck me wasn't how sloppy it was how methodical. Someone had been managing appearances, not outcomes. I cross-referenced the timestamps with my calendar. Work meetings. Commutes. A dentist appointment. A late-night grocery run. Every response sent under my name coincided with a moment I could prove I wasn't the one responding. It was the kind of evidence no one planned for because it didn't feel like evidence. It felt like background noise, system residue. That night, I didn't call Lauren. I didn't confront her. I didn't even feel the urge to. The story had shifted again, and this time, it wasn't about interpretation. It was about documentation. The next morning, my lawyer called me before I had a chance to reach out to her. "I got the city's follow-up," she said. "This is useful." End quote. Useful was her version of promising. She explained that what I had now wasn't proof of malicious intent. It didn't need to be. It was proof of misrepresentation, of authority exercised without authorization, of a pattern of behavior that contradicted the structure on paper. "This is where systems matter," she said, "because they don't care who meant what, they care who did what, when." I asked what that meant for me. "It means you're no longer guessing," she replied. "You're documenting." If you were asked. Over the next week, I did exactly that. I requested logs from the bank, from the property management firm, from the booking platform used for the rental. Each request was formal, written, unemotional. Each response added another layer to the same picture. Lauren, meanwhile, went quiet. No texts, no calls, no attempts to smooth things over. The silence felt deliberate now, strategic. I imagined her, recalculating, reassessing the risk. I wondered if she realized yet that the leverage she thought she had was shifting. The strange thing was how ordinary my days still felt. I went to work, I made dinner, I watched a show at night that I barely followed. On the surface, nothing dramatic was happening. Underneath, a record was assembling itself. One evening, as I was organizing the documents into labeled folders, I found something I hadn't been looking for: a version history. It was buried in the metadata of a document submitted to the city months earlier, a compliance response drafted, edited, and re-uploaded several times. Each edit logged, each save recorded. The name attached to the edits wasn't mine. It was Lauren's. Not her assistant, not the property manager. Her. The edits weren't major. A sentence softened, a deadline extended, a phrase adjusted to sound more reassuring. But the presence of her name there, in that context, mattered. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. This was the detail she hadn't accounted for. Not because she was careless, but because she'd assumed the system was neutral territory, that as long as the outcomes looked acceptable, no one would trace the process. She'd underestimated how much systems remember. I forwarded the document to my lawyer with a short note. "Found this," she replied an hour later. "That's significant." Significant didn't mean explosive, it meant actionable. We talked through next steps, not dramatic ones, no ultimatums, no threats, just notices, requests for correction, a formal demand for reassignment of authority, a deadline. "This isn't about punishing her," my lawyer said. It's about correcting the record. The phrase stayed with me. Correcting the record. That was all I wanted. Not vindication, not apology, just alignment between responsibility and control. I drafted the demand letter with my lawyer's guidance. It laid out the facts plainly: the audit trail, the misrepresentations, the risk exposure. It requested immediate transfer of authority or removal of my name from the entity, along with indemnification for actions taken without my consent. I read it twice before signing. Not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel the weight of my own name on something I fully understood. We sent it certified. Lauren called me that night. Her voice was different now. Quieter. Less performative. She asked why I was doing this. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm responding." She accused me of trying to ruin her. I didn't argue. I told her this wasn't about outcomes for her. It was about exposure for me. She said she never intended for it to go this far. I believed her. That didn't change anything. "What do you want?" she asked. I told her. Authority or removal. In writing. By the deadline. She said she needed to think. The deadline came and went without a response. Instead, something else happened. The bank reached out. They'd received an internal alert, triggered by the audit trail review. There were discrepancies, they said. Authorization conflicts. They needed clarification. I scheduled a call. On that call, I explained everything again. Calmly, factually. I provided documentation. I answered questions. At the end of the call, the representative thanked me and said they would restrict account activity pending resolution. Restrict. I hung up and sat quietly for a moment. Lauren called me 20 minutes later. She was angry this time. Not defensive, not dismissive, angry. She said I'd blindsided her, that I'd gone behind her back, that I'd jeopardized deals. I listened until she ran out of words. "I didn't go behind your back," I said. "I stepped out from in front of you." There was a sharp inhale on the line. "You're doing this on purpose," she said. "Yes," I replied. "I am. It's not unfirsted." We ended the call without resolution, but something had changed. Not emotionally, structurally. The following days brought a flurry of activity. Emails, requests, revisions. Lauren's assistant reached out asking for documents. The property management firm asked who they should now report to. The city sent a notice acknowledging receipt of corrective plans. I stayed consistent. Everything went through my lawyer. Everything was documented. It wasn't satisfying in the way people imagine justice to be. There was no moment of triumph, no speech, just a steady rebalancing. One afternoon, as I was filing away the latest batch of emails, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't thinking about Lauren much anymore. Not her motives, not her feelings, not our history. She had receded into the background, replaced by processes and records and timelines. The system didn't care that she was my sister. It only cared about alignment. And so did I. When the formal amendment finally came through, my name removed from operational authority, liability reassigned, indemnification documented, I read it slowly. Not with relief, exactly, but with recognition. This was what power looked like when it wasn't loud. That night, I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet of my living room. The house felt the same. The street outside sounded the same. Nothing had changed on the surface, but underneath, something fundamental had shifted. I had learned that evidence doesn't always come as a dramatic reveal. Sometimes it arrives as a spreadsheet, a timestamp, a version history no one thought to hide. And once you see it, once you understand how the system records truth without caring about feelings, you can never go back to pretending you don't know how it works. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be about trust. It would be about record. Once the bank restricted the account, the pace of everything changed. Not outwardly. There were no sirens, no legal threats, no dramatic phone calls from unknown numbers. What changed was the density. Messages began arriving closer together. Questions that had been theoretical became urgent. People who had previously routed around me now needed answers from me. And for the first time since this began, I didn't rush to respond. I took a full day before replying to anything. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was finally in a position where time worked for me instead of against me. That felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. I was used to being the one who smoothed things over quickly, who prevented delays, who made sure no one else felt the impact of a loose end. I let the loose ends exist. The first email I answered was from the property management firm. They asked who had final authority on compliance decisions while the account was restricted. I replied with one sentence, copied to my lawyer. Until the amendment is fully executed, all communications should be directed through counsel. That was it. No explanation. No justification. No emotional framing. The response came back within minutes. Understood. That word carried more weight than any apology I'd received from Lauren. The next message was from the city. They acknowledged receipt of the corrective plan and requested confirmation of who would be responsible for implementation going forward. Again, I responded briefly, with documentation attached. Again, I copied my lawyer. Each reply was deliberate, measured, boring, even. And yet, each one shifted the structure slightly in my favor. Lauren tried calling again that evening. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was different this time. Less accusatory, more urgent. She said the restriction was affecting cash flow. She said vendors were asking questions. She said she needed this resolved quickly. She said, "We need to talk like adults." I listened to the message twice before deleting it. We were talking like adults, just not directly anymore. The following day, my lawyer forwarded me a draft of the formal amendment. It reassigned operational authority entirely, removed my name from any future liability, and included indemnification for past actions taken without my consent. It wasn't aggressive. It was precise. "This puts you back where you should have been," my lawyer wrote. "Outside the blast radius." Blast radius. Another phrase that stayed with me. We sent the draft to Lauren's attorney, whose name I recognized from previous filings. The response came back the next morning with suggested revisions. Minor changes. Clarifications. No outright refusals. Negotiation had begun, whether Lauren liked it or not. What struck me most during that phase was how quickly everyone adjusted to the new reality. Vendors stopped asking Lauren questions and started emailing my lawyer. The property manager requested written confirmation of the new reporting structure. The city acknowledged the updated chain of responsibility without comment. No one asked how I felt. They didn't need to. This was the part of the story people rarely talk about. The middle ground. The administrative stretch where nothing looks dramatic but everything is being decided. It required patience, not the passive kind I'd relied on before, but an active one. A patience rooted in boundaries. Lauren texted me one afternoon, a long message this time. She said she felt betrayed. She said family shouldn't involve lawyers. She said she never thought I'd do this to her. I read it once and didn't respond. That silence wasn't punishment. It was accuracy. There was nothing left to explain. I realized then that the most radical thing I'd done wasn't restricting access or demanding amendments. It was refusing to manage her emotional reaction alongside the consequences of her actions. That had always been my role. Translator, buffer, stabilizer. I had stepped out of it. The hearing outcome arrived the following week. Fines assessed, deadlines set, compliance required under the revised structure. The language was dry, procedural, final. My name appeared once, as a former managing member no longer responsible for ongoing operations. Former. I sat back in my chair and let that word land. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like accuracy restored. Lauren called that night. I answered this time. Her voice was tight. She said she'd signed the amendment. She said she felt cornered. She said she hoped this hadn't permanently damaged our relationship. I listened. When she finished, I said something that surprised even me. "This didn't damage our relationship," I said. "It revealed it." There was silence on the line. "I didn't know you'd go this far," she said. "I didn't either," I replied. "Until I had to." We ended the call politely. Not warmly. Not cruelly. Just finished. In the days that followed, things settled into a new configuration. Emails slowed. The folder on my desktop stopped growing. The tension in my shoulders eased in a way I hadn't noticed building. One evening, I realized I hadn't thought about the property in hours, then days. My attention returned to my own life, my own work. the routines I'd put on hold while managing a problem that was never supposed to be mine. I cooked dinner without checking my phone. I slept through the night. I went for a walk after work and noticed how the trees along my street had started to change color. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had been publicly exposed. No truth had been shouted from rooftops. But the balance had shifted. The system now reflected reality instead of obscuring it. I understood then that this was my response. Not disappearing, not forgiving prematurely, not exploding. Engaging the structure until it could no longer pretend I wasn't there. This wasn't revenge. It was alignment. And for the first time since I'd signed those 6 pages at my kitchen island, my name meant exactly what it was supposed to mean. Nothing more. Nothing less. After the amendment was finalized, the world didn't pause to acknowledge it. There was no moment where everything stopped and reset. No clean break. What followed was quieter and more disorienting. The slow realization that the system had already moved on. Emails that once included my name stopped doing so. New threads appeared without me copied. Decisions were made and executed without my awareness. And for the first time, that absence felt correct instead of threatening. I hadn't been erased. I had been released. At work, I noticed how quickly my focus returned to things that actually belonged to me. I caught errors in reports that I would have missed a month earlier. I contributed to meetings without feeling distracted. My manager commented casually that I seemed more present lately. I smiled and agreed, though I didn't explain why. Presence had been a luxury I couldn't afford when my name was carrying someone else's risk. Lauren, meanwhile, struggled with the adjustment. Not in any visible way. There were no public missteps, no dramatic fallout, but the friction showed up in the margins. Vendors questioned delays. The property manager requested additional approvals. The bank flagged transactions more frequently now that the structure was being watched more closely. None of that was my problem anymore. That was the hardest part to internalize. Not because I wanted to help, but because I had been conditioned to smooth transitions, to step in when something faltered. Resisting that impulse took conscious effort. I had to remind myself that stepping back wasn't cruelty. It was consistency. A week after everything settled, Lauren sent me a short text. "Can we get coffee?" I stared at it longer than necessary. There was a version of me, not that long ago, who would have said yes immediately. Who would have seen it as a chance to repair, to reassure, to return things to a version of normal that felt familiar, even if it wasn't healthy. I typed, deleted, and retyped my response before settling on something simple. "I'm not ready for that." She didn't reply. That boundary felt heavier than any legal document I'd signed, not because it was dramatic, but because it was irreversible in a way the paperwork wasn't. It marked a shift in how I understood responsibility not just for actions, but for access. The weeks that followed were defined by small recalibrations. I updated my financial records. I closed out folders that no longer needed monitoring. I unsubscribed from alerts I'd set during the height of the situation. Each action felt like exhaling after holding my breath for too long. One evening, I sat at my dining table and opened the legal pad I'd used to track the timeline. I flipped through the pages slowly. Dates, notes, underlined phrases, the story of how something had been built around me without my awareness. I realized how methodical I'd been, even under stress, how much energy it had taken to remain composed while everything shifted beneath me, and how little of that work anyone else had seen. That was fine. I didn't need witnesses, I needed resolution. Lauren didn't reach out again for a while. When she did, it wasn't about the property. It was about our mother's birthday plans. A group text, neutral and logistical. I responded with the same tone. The distance between us had changed the shape of our interactions. Not hostile, just narrower. I thought often about the belief that had guided me before all this, that staying reasonable would keep me safe. It wasn't entirely wrong. Reason had kept me functional. It had allowed me to respond instead of react, but it hadn't protected me from being used. Protection, I was learning, required visibility. Not emotional visibility, structural visibility. Being legible to the systems that mattered. One afternoon, my lawyer called with a final update. The bank restrictions had been lifted under the revised structure. The city had closed the compliance case. Everything was, officially, done. Is there anything else you need from me? She asked. I thought about it. About the months of vigilance. About the way my life had bent around a problem that shouldn't have existed. No, I said. I think that's it. We hung up, and I sat there for a moment, phone still in my hand. There was no rush of relief, no emotional payoff, just a quiet certainty that this chapter had ended. That night, I dreamed of my kitchen island. The chipped mugs, the yellow tabs, the tapping phone. But this time, when I reached for the pen, it wasn't there. The moment passed without action. I woke up feeling lighter than I had in months. In the days that followed, I noticed how often people assumed compliance came naturally to me. How frequently I was still asked to take on tasks that involved absorbing risk without authority. At work, in friendships, in family dynamics. Each time, I paused. Sometimes I said yes, sometimes I didn't. The difference was that the choice was conscious now. One Saturday morning, I ran into Lauren at the grocery store. It was inevitable, given how close we lived. The encounter was brief, polite. We talked about produce prices and traffic. We avoided anything real. As we parted, she said, "You've changed." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't apologize. Yes, I said, that was all. Walking back to my car, I felt a familiar urge to analyze the interaction, to wonder what she meant, to question whether I should have said more. The urge faded quickly. Not everything required processing anymore. Later that week, I received a notification from the state portal, an automatic reminder to file an annual report for an entity I was no longer associated with. I logged in, updated the information, and removed myself from the contact list entirely. It took less than 5 minutes. I closed the browser and laughed softly to myself. Not because it was funny, but because it was done. What surprised me most about the aftermath wasn't how angry I felt, or didn't feel. It was how much energy I'd reclaimed, mental space I hadn't realized was occupied, time I'd been spending on vigilance instead of living. The system had absorbed the conflict and moved on. That was its nature. It didn't care about fairness or feelings. It cared about records matching reality. And for once, that worked in my favor. I understood now that the most effective response I'd chosen wasn't confrontation. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't silence, either. It was insisting that my name only appear where my consent existed. That lesson settled into me slowly, deeply. I didn't know yet how it would change the rest of my life, but I knew this much with certainty. I would never again confuse proximity with permission. And whatever came next, I would enter it with my eyes open, my boundaries intact, and my name exactly where it belonged. I didn't expect to hear about the fallout so soon. That was the mistake I kept making, assuming consequences followed emotion, or timing, or some kind of moral arc. In reality, they followed exposure. Once the structure was visible, it didn't need my involvement anymore. It began to correct itself. The first sign came indirectly, through someone who had nothing to do with our family. I was finishing a late afternoon meeting at work when my phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. The message was cautious, almost apologetic. "Hi, this is Mark from Silverline Property Management. We spoke briefly a few weeks ago. I wanted to confirm, are you no longer associated with the downtown rental?" I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "Correct. Please direct all future inquiries to counsel listed in the amended filing," he responded almost immediately. "Thank you. That explains a lot." That last line stayed with me. Later that evening, my lawyer forwarded me an email she'd received earlier that day. It was from the same firm. The tone was professional but strained. They were requesting clarification on several past submissions made under my name. Apparently, the city had asked questions after reviewing the updated compliance materials. Not accusations, questions. Questions were dangerous. I closed the email and set my phone down. For the first time, I felt something close to anticipation, not satisfaction, not vindication, just awareness. The system was doing what systems do when records don't align. 2 days later, Lauren called. I almost didn't answer, not out of avoidance, but because I sensed that whatever this was, it wouldn't be a conversation I could manage or fix. Still, I picked up. She didn't bother with pleasantries. They're auditing, she said. I waited. The city, she clarified. They want explanations for past filings. They're asking about authorization. I pictured the audit trail again. The timestamps, the version histories, the quiet persistence of data. What are you telling them? I asked. That it was a misunderstanding, she replied. That things were handled internally. I said nothing. They're asking why you weren't informed, she continued. Why responses were submitted without your knowledge. There it was. The question she couldn't answer without implicating herself. I told them I thought you were aware, she said. And? I asked. They asked for proof. I closed my eyes. This was the moment I'd been bracing for, without realizing it. Not because I wanted it to happen, but because it was inevitable once the structure stopped protecting her. I don't have proof, she said quietly. No, I replied. You don't. She accused me then. Not directly, but indirectly. She said the situation had escalated unnecessarily. She said things would have stayed manageable if I hadn't involved outside parties. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I said one sentence. The outside parties were already involved. I just stopped shielding you from them. She went quiet. They're asking for written explanations, she said finally, from everyone listed in the filings. That makes sense, I replied. She asked me what I planned to do. I'm not planning anything, I said. I already responded. She knew what that meant. The call ended without resolution, but something had shifted again. This time, it wasn't inside me. It was around her. Over the next week, pieces of the story reached me through indirect channels. Not gossip, not family chatter, administrative ripples. The property management firm terminated their contract. The bank extended the restriction pending review of historical activity. The city scheduled a secondary compliance review, not a hearing, just a review. Each action was procedural. None of them required my involvement. That was the point. I didn't hear from Lauren during that period. Not once. The silence felt different now. Not strategic, protective. One evening, my mother called. She didn't mention the property. She asked how I was doing. She told me she'd spoken to Lauren recently, and that things seemed stressful over there. Her tone was careful, as if navigating unstable ground. I listened without filling in the gaps. I hope you two can work things out, she said. I hope so too, I replied. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't a commitment. A few days later, the audit results landed not with a bang, but with an email. My lawyer forwarded it with a short note. For your information. The city had concluded that prior responses had been submitted by individuals without proper authorization, no finding of intent, no accusations of fraud, just a determination that the record was inaccurate. Corrective actions were outlined, fines adjusted, a formal notice issued to the current managing party. My name did not appear anywhere in the document. I read it twice. Lauren called that night. Her voice sounded tired. Not angry. Not defensive, just worn down by friction she could no longer redirect. They're making me refile everything, she said. Every response, every form. That's standard, I replied. They're questioning my judgment, she said. I didn't respond. I didn't think it would turn into this, she added. I know, I said. That was the closest we came to agreement. She didn't apologize. I didn't ask her to. Apologies wouldn't have changed anything now. The consequences were already moving, slow and steady. In the weeks that followed, Lauren's world narrowed, not dramatically. No public scandal. No legal catastrophe. Just friction. More oversight. Less flexibility. The kind of constraints that make every decision heavier. The system had stopped taking her at her word. And that, I realized, was the real exposure. One afternoon, I received a final email from the property management firm. They thanked me for my cooperation and apologized for the confusion earlier in the year. They said they'd updated their records and wished me well. I didn't reply. That night, I sat on my couch and thought about how all of this would look from the outside. Uneventful, bureaucratic, boring, even. No one would point to a single moment and say, that's where it turned. But I knew. It turned when the structure stopped absorbing her risk and started reflecting it. Lauren texted me a few days later. A short message. I didn't realize how much you were carrying. I stared at the words for a long time. I didn't either, I typed back. We didn't say anything else. The strange thing was that I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I'd won something. What I felt was distance clear, necessary distance. The system hadn't punished her. It had simply required her to stand where she'd placed me. And that was enough. By the time everything settled, I understood something I hadn't before. You don't need to expose someone loudly to reveal them. You just need to step out of the way and let the structure they built finally support its own weight. I thought the end would feel clearer. That once the audits finished, once the filings were corrected, once my name disappeared from places it never belonged, there would be a clean emotional resolution, relief, closure, maybe even a sense of justice. What I didn't expect was the unease. Not fear, not regret, something quieter. The discomfort of realizing that the story I'd been telling myself about responsibility, about fairness, about how things break and how they're fixed was incomplete. The audit didn't accuse Lauren of fraud. It didn't label her actions as malicious. It didn't deliver the kind of moral clarity people crave when they talk about accountability. It did something far more unsettling. It showed that everything she'd done existed inside the rules. The filings had been legal, the structure had been valid, the authority had been misused, but not illegally claimed. The system didn't punish intent, it corrected records. There was no villain to point at. No moment where someone was formally declared wrong, just a redistribution of weight. That realization bothered me more than I expected. For weeks afterward, I replayed moments from the beginning. Not the obvious ones, the signing, the emails, the hearing, but the smaller decisions. The pauses where I'd chosen convenience over clarity. The moments where I'd told myself that asking fewer questions was the same as being kind. I started to see how much of my identity had been built around being easy to work with, easy to trust, easy to lean on. I'd worn that as a badge of honor, never considering how easily it could be mistaken for permission. One evening, as I was cleaning out a drawer in my home office, I found the legal pad I'd used to map out the timeline. The first page was dated weeks before the hearing. The handwriting was tight, controlled, careful. I flipped through it slowly. The early entries were tentative. Question marks. Ask Lauren? Probably nothing. Follow up later. The later pages were cleaner. Dates, facts, certainty. I realized then that the transformation hadn't been about standing up to my sister. It had been about standing still long enough to see myself clearly. Lauren and I spoke less after everything settled. When we did, it was surface level. Logistics, family updates, no references to what had happened unless necessary. At first, that distance felt like loss. Then it felt like honesty. One afternoon, months later, she said something that finally clarified the difference between us. We were on the phone discussing holiday plans, our voices careful, when she said, "I just didn't think you'd draw such a hard line." I didn't respond right away. Not because I was offended, but because I was curious. "I didn't think I was drawing one," I said. "I thought I was correcting a mistake." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the difference. I saw it as flexible. You saw it as fixed." That was it. Not good versus bad, not right versus wrong, flexible versus fixed. She'd built her life around adaptability, around moving quickly, around bending structures until they worked for her. I'd built mine around stability, around assuming the structures would hold if I respected them. Neither of us had been entirely wrong, but I'd been the one standing underneath when they shifted. After that conversation, I stopped expecting remorse from her. Not because she was incapable of it, but because remorse wasn't the point. The system hadn't required it, and neither did I. The real twist, the one I hadn't anticipated, was that the resolution didn't make me feel safer. It made me feel responsible. Not for Lauren's choices, for my own thresholds. I began noticing how often I'd been giving away authority in small, everyday ways. At work, in friendships, in family dynamics. Agreeing to things without fully understanding them because I trusted the other person's confidence more than my own questions. That trust hadn't been misplaced because people were bad. It had been misplaced because I'd outsourced discernment. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. A few weeks later, my manager asked if I'd be willing to temporarily oversee a project outside my scope. The language was familiar, just for now, short term, nothing to worry about. I asked for documentation. He looked surprised, not offended, just unaccustomed to the request. We clarified roles, defined authority, set timelines. The project went smoothly. That small moment mattered more to me than the audit ever had. It told me the lesson had stuck. The final conversation with Lauren came unexpectedly. She invited me to coffee one Saturday morning. I hesitated, then agreed. Not because I wanted to revisit the past, but because I wanted to see if the present could hold us without distortion. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, the kind with mismatched chairs and chipped mugs that reminded me too much of my own kitchen. She talked about her work. I talked about mine. For a while, it felt almost normal. Then she said, carefully, "Do you regret how it played out?" I thought about the question longer than she probably expected. "No," I said finally, "but I regret how long it took me to notice." She nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. "I don't think I'd do it differently," she said. "I just wish I'd been more honest about what I was asking from you." I believed her. "I wish I'd been more honest about what I was giving," I replied. We sat in silence after that. Not awkward, just full. When we left, we hugged. Not tightly, not performatively, just enough. Walking to my car, I felt the weight of the story settle into something manageable. Not neat, not resolved in the way stories like to be resolved, but integrated. The twist wasn't that my sister had betrayed me. The twist was that no one had taken anything I hadn't already handed over. The system hadn't failed me. It had done exactly what it was designed to do: allocate responsibility according to record. I had failed to check the record. That realization didn't make me smaller. It made me precise. I no longer saw trust as a moral virtue on its own. I saw it as a tool, useful only when paired with clarity. I no longer believed that staying reasonable would protect me. I believed that staying awake would. In the end, the story wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about family loyalty or legal accountability. It was about learning the difference between kindness and consent. And once you know that difference, really know it, you don't just protect yourself. You change how you move through everything that comes after. Life didn't announce itself as different after that. It just stopped pulling at me in the same places. The first thing I noticed was how quiet my phone had become. Not empty, just clean. Fewer alerts. Fewer messages that carried urgency without substance. Fewer requests disguised as favors. I hadn't changed my number or blocked anyone. I'd simply stopped responding to things that weren't actually mine to hold. That quiet wasn't loneliness. It was space. I started using it carefully. In the months that followed, I made small, unremarkable decisions that would have felt unnecessary before. I read documents all the way through. I asked who else was listed. I asked what would happen if something went wrong, not as a challenge, but as a baseline question. When someone said, "It's just temporary," I asked for a date. When someone said, "Everyone does it this way," I asked who benefited. Most people didn't mind. Some were surprised. A few were annoyed. None of that was my problem anymore. Lauren and I settled into a version of sisterhood that was thinner but sturdier. We talked about surface things. We showed up to family gatherings. We stood beside each other in photos without leaning. The space between us wasn't hostile. It was accurate. I stopped trying to fill it. Our mother asked once, gently, if everything was truly okay between us. I told her the truth. "It's clearer," I said. She nodded, as if that answered something she'd been wondering about for a long time. Work changed too, though no one could have pointed to a single moment when it did. I was offered a promotion that came with more responsibility and, for the first time, clearly defined authority. I asked questions before accepting. I requested the role description in writing. I negotiated scope. When I signed that contract, I felt something I hadn't felt with the others. Alignment. At home, I reorganized my office. Not because it needed it, but because I wanted the space to reflect who I was now. I shredded old documents I no longer needed. I archived the digital folders and labeled them clearly. I didn't delete them. I didn't need to. They belonged to the past, but they didn't threaten the present. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I found the chipped coffee mug we'd used that Tuesday afternoon. The one Lauren and I had laughed about. The one I'd kept out of habit, not affection. I turned it over in my hands, noticing the hairline crack I'd never paid attention to before. I threw it away. Not ceremoniously, not angrily, just because it had served its purpose and was no longer useful. That felt like a fitting end to the story. People sometimes ask me now, when I tell them a softened version of what happened, whether I'd do anything differently. They expect regret, or bitterness, or a triumphant lesson neatly tied with a bow. I tell them no. Not because it didn't cost me anything, it did. It cost me an illusion I'd lived comfortably inside for years. It cost me a version of closeness that depended on my silence. It cost me the comfort of believing that being reasonable was the same as being safe. But it gave me something better. Precision. I no longer mistake access for intimacy. I no longer assume familiarity equals goodwill. I don't confuse trust with surrender. And most importantly, I don't wait for harm to announce itself loudly before I pay attention. The system didn't save me. I didn't outsmart it either. I learned how it worked, and then I stopped standing where it could crush me. That knowledge didn't make me harder. It made me cleaner in my choices. It let me move through the world without carrying weight that wasn't mine, without managing outcomes for people who hadn't asked for my consent. If there's a moral here, it isn't dramatic. No one is coming to protect your boundaries if you don't name them. No structure will honor you if you disappear inside it. And no amount of good intention replaces clarity. I still believe people are mostly decent. I still believe in cooperation. I still believe in family. I just believe those things function best when everyone is standing where they actually belong. And I've learned to check that quietly, thoroughly, and without apology before I ever sign my name again.